podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Welcome back to Tennis Unfiltered. Yes, you may be slightly alarmed to hear my voice. That is George Bellshaw's voice first up, and not the dulcet tones of James Gray. We are without our lead anchor this week, so I will try and roughly guide us through the week's tennis activity. I'm joined, as ever, by the late, the great Calvin Betton, who hasn't died. I don't know why I said late. And he wasn't late either, so I'm really just digging him out for no reason. How are you, Calvin?
Yeah, I'm all right. Just had a weekend of girls under 18s county cup at Bath, which is probably the most tiring week of the weekend of the year that I do. So I'm a bit shattered, but yeah, I'm all right.
Successful weekend?
We finished, the Yorkshire girls finished second behind a very, very strong Surrey team. That was maybe the strongest team I've ever seen at girls 18s county cup.
High praise indeed for the mighty Surrey. And equally mighty is the world-renowned tennis commentator Abigail Johnson, who is backed on Tennis Unfiltered. Abigail, how are you? Welcome to the show again. Thank you for filling in.
Thank you. I'm much better after that intro, one of the better ones I've received. I'm also grateful for, on your behalf, George, that you get a week off from James Gray slating you. He tries to call you like a semi-retired tennis writer or something. And at the times I've listened in, this seems to be a bit of a theme. So I'm glad that you get a breather from that one.
That's very kind. I mean, I did until you just brought it up again, Abigail. But
yeah, I know. I've ruined it. But yeah, he's pretty harsh, James. He really digs. He really does.
Well, we've got a high quality lineup on the show, even in James's absence, and we're going to start with someone who's arguably been the highest quality player in the world on the men's side over the last 3 weeks. That's right. It's Daniil Medvedev. He's picked up his third title of the season, making him the tour leader. This one came in Dubai. And I think I'm right in saying the most significant result of the week was his semi-final win, which was against the mighty Novak Djokovic, the world number one, who was on a big 21-match win streak and unbeaten this season. We've spoken a lot about where Medvedev is. Obviously, he's been picking up some form, beating players that perhaps a couple of years ago we still would have said, yes, we'd back Medvedev to win, but that confidence seems to be back, and a win over Djokovic feels like quite a big step. Abigail, do you see it the same way?
Oh, absolutely. I've been very specifically, I'm going to say, tracking Daniil Medvedev kind of the past few years. He's a player that when he first came onto the scene, I was pretty indifferent on. And then as time has gone on, I love the complete package that he brings to the table in terms of the tennis, in terms of the stuff on the mic. I think he's great. But no, it's definitely he's definitely found himself again. I don't think that he ever disappeared completely. I don't think he ever completely fell off the radar, but I think I would say he's gone from his average back to his best, in my feeling. That win over Djokovic was massive because as much as I felt his form has been there in recent weeks, I guess people will point to kind of the different matches that he's had. Has he been tested enough? Is it enough to say that he's kind of fully back to where he was? I think with Djokovic, he was so clearly the superior player that there was a really strange match, I felt, in terms of the way Djokovic kind of disintegrated and he got impatient and he was ballooning forehands and everything, which is what you tend to see happen to other players against Djokovic. But I truly feel that Medvedev at his best is one of the only players, maybe the only player that can actually do that to Djokovic in terms of lay the foundation for him to collapse, which is what we saw. And having watched a fair amount of Medvedev over the last few weeks, I'm struggling to see who can actually last with him physically at the moment. I'd be interested to hear Calvin's opinion on this, because I don't really see who's going to, and I'm not just talking in terms of the physicality as well, but in terms of, let's look at the final of Dubai against Andre Rublev. And I feel like Rublev actually came into that match with a clear game plan. Okay, let's go in deep to the backhand. Let's get up the court, short to the forehand. And we saw these patterns of him moving up quickly, trying to finish off, playing out in the early stages. But then Medvedev's going to extend the match and extend the points, and he's going to be holding his own serve so emphatically, as we saw. So mentally, how long can you stay with that, and how long can you keep producing? And Rublev couldn't. And so who's going to be able to hang with him and keep producing strategically the length of time they need to, because Medvedev's never going to go down easy. And then whose body is going to be up to that test as well? Because we saw this in 2019. Medvedev went on that crazy run at the back end of the year, and you thought surely he's got to get tired at some point, and he still took Nadal to 5 sets in the final of the US Open. So you asked the question, who can actually outlast him when he's feeling this good in this kind of form? And I guess you go to Novak Djokovic and Carlos Alcaraz. Well, Djokovic can't contest Indian Wells and Miami, as I'm sure we will discuss. And Alcaraz is having a few injury hiccups right now. So I think really Medvedev is establishing himself as right at the very, very top of the game at the moment. That was a huge ramble from me, wasn't it? Wow. Here we go.
Big monologue. Big monologue.
Massive eye opener. Calvin's not used to that much listening. That would have been tough for Calvin.
So just to quickly recap who he's beaten this week outside of Djokovic, because there was more than one man in the draw that he had to get past. There was Arnaldi in the first round, Bublik, Coric, then Djokovic, then Rublev, not dropped a set again. I mean, Calvin, just picking up on Abigail's points there about who can actually last with Medvedev. I mean, it's felt to me when you've analysed Medvedev recently, you're actually saying it's the people who hit through him will actually have the greatest success. But is this a really bad matchup for Djokovic now that Medvedev's kind of recovered this form, and is he sort of the anti-Djokovic at this stage of his career?
It's a weird one when they play each other, because they had that really good match at the start of this year when I think Medvedev had to withdraw, didn't he? But before that, the level was good. Yeah. But other than that, they've not really. Every time they play each other, one of them doesn't play very well, or one of them plays exceptionally well, and the other and wins easy. We've not seen them where they've both been playing great for some time. And I'm interested to see what happens there. In terms of who, I do think he'll win at least one of Miami or Indian Wells. I can't see him not doing, to be honest, because he's so good on hard courts outdoors. And like you say, with Djokovic not playing, we don't know what the state of Alcaraz's injury is. I think I would still favour Alcaraz to beat him, I think, if they played and he's fully fit. And then you're down to the players who can hit through him, which would be, I'm just looking at the rankings here. Tsitsipas, he beat him last time, I think, didn't he? Although Medvedev's record against Tsitsipas is very much in favour of Medvedev. Fritz is always quite good in that swing. You'd still have to favour Medvedev. Sinner, maybe. But other than that, I think, you'd make him 65, 70% favourite against anybody, I would think, at the minute, on a hard court outdoors.
And from Novak's perspective, how hard is it to kind of stop your season at that point for a moment? You've lost to a guy we all think is going to be pushing him for number one potentially by the end of the season, given his form at the moment. He's now unable to go to Indian Wells. How damaging do you see this result for Abigail in terms of pincing that cloak of invincibility, if you like?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think that result specifically does much to Djokovic at all, if anything. I think the fact that he's not allowed to play Indian Wells and Miami and the sheer frustration over that decision, that is more of an obstacle than any specific loss that he's had on the match court. I mean, we only have to rewind a couple of months to the last time Djokovic beat Medvedev. Actually, that disguised that Medvedev had a fairly, not by his standards, but a fairly positive start to the season. In Adelaide, he only lost to Djokovic. At the Australian Open, he lost out to Sebi Korda, who was at a very high level. And actually, there were flashes for Medvedev there of what we've seen in the past. He was just a little bit slow bringing it to the table. So there was a lot of suggestion already that he could bring this kind of form. But back to Djokovic, yeah, I think that, look, he's not. This is not a new situation for him. He's been sidelined from tournaments on and off for a while now, and I feel like for Djokovic, the majors are such a priority now that anything that happens outside of those, I don't think he's going to let get under his skin too much. Whoever he's losing to, whatever this tournament is, whatever stage of the tournament it is, I think he's mastered the ability to kind of put his mind and his best performances where it matters most. And in terms of the other Grand Slams this season, I don't see that particular result having any bearing or significant impact.
Just on Djokovic, I'm sure most listeners will have seen he is not allowed to play in Indian Wells. He's not been granted an exemption, a word we've used all sorts of times over the last couple of years in tennis since COVID broke out. He's technically not out of Miami just yet, I believe. I'm right in saying there's still some lobbying going on in Florida from certain governments, but it does feel like the writing's on the wall that he's not going to get an exemption for that either. Calvin, is there any positive that could come from this? And I'm thinking in terms of preparing for the French Open, having a couple of months on clay, get himself really up to speed on that. Is that the one positive spin from this, or does Djokovic lose a lot from not playing these events that maybe aren't as important to him these days as they were perhaps 10 years ago?
I don't think it makes much difference either way, but I think he would probably rather have the matches than more time on clay. And I think, he still likes winning those big events. So yeah, he definitely preferred to play it. He's got plenty of time to play on clay before the French Open. He tends to not play that well at Miami, even usually. Not Miami, Monte Carlo. And then he's got all the other 250s, 500. Well, he won't play many 250s, but 500s and the Masters series. I don't think he's got a problem with getting minutes on the clay court. He'd much rather play in Indian Wells in Miami.
He can lose his number one ranking, of course, to Carlos Alcaraz if he wins Indian Wells. But Alcaraz does have to defend Miami points the week after. So there could be, Novak may well live to see another day as world number one. I mean, quite an interesting stat I saw this week. This will now be the only Masters event to not have a big three winner. That's Djokovic, Federer and Nadal for the uninitiated within its last 5 editions. Fritz, Norrie, Team, Del Potro and whoever wins this year. I thought that was quite a fun stat and shows perhaps that these tournaments have struggled to really feel as significant as they once were, maybe over the last few years, in the sense of not getting the big three fit and firing there. Or is that harsh and part of my agenda, Calvin?
I think probably is, yeah. Probably someone with a crocodile in their Twitter bio would say it's part of your agenda. Yeah, I mean, there's circumstances, isn't there? Federer's retired, so he wasn't going to play it. He's pretty much been retired for the last 2 years anyway. We had COVID. Djokovic can't play when COVID's on. Nadal tends to have this spell out anyway, as a rule, although he did play last year, I think, didn't he? There's reasons why. I think if all things being equal, one of them would have won in the last 5 years at some stage, if they were all playing and fully fit and of an age where they're not retiring.
Yeah, George, you said, does it feel the same? I think it's more, does it feel the same with a D at the end? Because there always seems to be one or two missing. And I think that definitely does factor in kind of the overall outcome, it seems. There just seems to be, something lacking in the lineup.
It's strange because the players think it's the best tournament outside the slams, don't they? Indian Wells.
5th Grand Slam.
So, although bizarrely, I saw that I think it was the Doha Open, have won ATP Tournament of the Year again for something like the 3rd year running in some vote, which made me think that might be a bit suspicious.
Couldn't possibly cast aspersions on that, Calvin.
Don't hear people really very often saying, don't hear people saying, "No, I just love Doha." It's just brilliant. I mean, I know they give a free iPhone out to the players every year, but other than
Oh
that,
my days, that's too good.
They
Let's all
surely
go.
all
Come
have
on.
one anyway. I mean, that just seems
it's
a
the
bit over
latest
the
edition.
top.
Well, the players tend to get a player gift at every tournament, and at Del Rey it was a water bottle, and at Doha it was an iPhone. So yeah,
Two ends of the scale there.
Yeah, Delray Beach, bottom of the class, Doha, top of it. I see how it works. Buying the
I'd much
prizes.
rather be in Del Rey, to be honest.
Without Djokovic, though, just returning to Indian Wells, Miami. The story now is it Medvedev v Alcaraz, and if that is the story we're happy with, who do we see coming out on top, Abigail?
I mean, for Indian Wells and Miami, I think I was gonna say it has to be those two, but we have such recency bias, right? I mean, Yannick Sinner was one of the best players in the world, 2 weeks ago? And he's consistently had good results at these two, well, not these two tournaments, but he lost to Alcaraz in the final of one of them last year, the year before. Had won Indian Wells maybe a couple of years ago. I should have checked my stats here before we came through, but I didn't know if I'd be talking about Yannick Sinner. But the fact is, he's a player who has been producing recently and has produced during this swing in the past. And while my instinct is to say that it's a Medvedev versus Alcaraz spotlight, I know that I too can be guilty of that recency bias because we're so moment with tennis all the time and constantly looking ahead. I just feel that there is a good mix in the men's game at the moment, and as much as we've said Medvedev has established himself and a fit Alcaraz is his biggest rival, I think there are plenty of players in that mix that have the ability to cause some trouble in the earlier rounds, but I want one of those finals to be Daniil Medvedev, Carlos Alcaraz, because I don't think they've faced off since 2021, at which point Alcaraz hadn't really broken through, and Medvedev, was he at his best? I don't know, but it was on grass courts as well. I think it was at Wimbledon, and so that's not Alcaraz's best surface, so I feel like this would be more of a level playing field with Medvedev just coming back to where he was and Alcaraz hopefully shaking off the injury. It's a match you want to see. It's a match you want to see for the trophy as well, I think, across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't disagree with that. Sinner was the runner-up in the 2021 Miami Open to Hubert Hurkacz. There we go.
There you go.
Got the stats coming.
And
one. You're right.
Daniil
Medvedev did beat Carlos Alcaraz at Wimbledon. 6-4, 6-1, 6-2. Do you expect that scoreline, albeit over best of 3 sets, to be a bit tighter this time, Calvin? Who would you see coming out on top if we do get that match over this little spell now?
I mean, I literally just said about 10 minutes ago that I thought Alcaraz would beat him, but I've changed my mind since then.
That's why I came to you with it. I thought you did.
Yeah.
Could tell.
Yeah, I think, you'd have to make, based on Alcaraz not having loads of matches, not having any matches on hard courts this year, and Medvedev winning his last 3, I think you'd have to make him favourite. But yeah, I'd like to see that final, but in Indian Wells, and both Indian Wells and Miami, you rarely get the top 2 seeds or the 2 best players making the final. You always have a bit of a wild card. Taylor Fritz won it last year. No one would have thought that. I think John Isner's won Miami a couple of times.
He has.
Just the once.
Yep.
Yeah, you get strange things happen at those tournaments. So, and also they won't be 1 and 2, will they? Are they 1 and 2 seeds?
No, it's just a pass, I believe.
Yeah, so they could end up in the same half of the draw.
Yeah.
Oh, no, please.
Let's hope not. Let's hope not. Right, we're going to take a very smooth segue to a very different subject, and it's the women's tour, and specifically a match that has generated quite a lot of interest all of a sudden, even though on paper, looking at the 2 names, stripped of context, you might not think, oh, this is the most exciting final of the year between Marta Kostyuk and Varvara Gracheva. But of course, given international waters at the minute, it was, of course, a Ukraine versus Russia final, and Ukraine triumphed with Kostyuk winning 6-3, 7-5 in Austin, Texas. Quite an interesting end to this match, Calvin, I've seen a headline put it as Kostyuk not shaking Gracheva's hand, but I'm not actually sure that seemed right to me. It just looked like it didn't happen full stop, or may even have been initiated by Gracheva. But I mean, it's a shame to take away from what was Kostyuk's first victory. But what are your kind of thoughts on that for her? She said it was an incredibly special moment for her, particularly given the circumstances.
I mean, yeah, I don't know the political positions of either player. I don't know whether they didn't get on. It didn't strike me that there would be a lot of this with the Ukrainian players refusing to shake hands. I don't know if it's happened, if any other Ukrainians have played any Russians in any of the tours before, but it seems a little bit extreme for me, unless is it Gracheva that she played? Yeah, unless she's expressed some great support to Putin and the war, it would seem a little bit extreme to me, and it's not really helpful, is it? But then again, I do empathise with Kostyuk, that she's from a country that's currently under invasion, and I'm sure she doesn't care what I think on it, but there's not a lot I can say on it, really.
I mean, Kostyuk, for the record, has been probably the most outspoken Ukrainian, I would say, on the tour. I mean, Svitolina was quite outspoken before she kind of moved out of the scene a little bit due to kind of personal pregnancy, etc.
I know Kostyuk has been vocal, and she just doesn't think Russian players should be playing at all, does she? That's seems to be her position. But I've seen this week again that Andre Rublev made another quite, it was a little bit veiled, but also quite a strong statement in support of ending the war. He said it was something to do with a poet or something. He wrote a line on. I saw something on Twitter. I don't know. I can't remember what the exact thing was, but he's been quite vocal and he's been quite strong on it. And I think it would be hugely unfair to say that, for example, Andre Rublev is banned from playing tennis. What would we be banning him for? Because he is openly opposed to the war, and he's hoping that the war would finish soon, and he's making all statements that we could reasonably expect a Russian person to make without putting himself and his family at danger. So I don't get what benefit would we get from banning him, for example, and then other people, I'm sure. I don't think Andre Medvedev, for example, is in favor of the war. So I don't really get what Kostyuk's point is. And again, we have to understand where tennis is in the big picture. Vladimir Putin isn't ending any wars because we're stopping tennis players playing tennis tournaments.
I mean, putting it the other way, Abigail, I mean, given how much this match will have meant to Kostyuk and, all that kind of extra stuff that's going on that makes it more than a tennis match, at least from her perspective, she played bloody well, didn't she? I mean, she put in a really good performance. She's taking care of business. It would have been easy to kind of get lost in that extra emotion that clearly would have been going through her mind in what's an incredibly tough time for her and her country.
Yeah, I think she's really been able to channel things, Kostyuk, I think, actually over the course of the last 6 months. My first memories of Kostyuk, she was the original 15-year-old wonder kid before Coco Gauff. It was Kostyuk that actually made the third round of the Australian Open as a 15-year-old. So that was my better memory of her. I've got to be completely honest, I've done a lot more ATP commentary as opposed to WTA in recent times, so I've not seen a lot of Kostyuk. What I have seen of her is great returning, great play on the return. I think you've got a lot of great returners on the WTA, but Kostyuk particularly always looking to keep that position aggressive. She gets right inside the baseline for the second serves, but she's also very willing to take herself up the court quite early. I also think she's got deceptively quite good hands. I think if you look at her initially and her tendencies, you wouldn't expect that of her, but certainly in Austin she was able to demonstrate some kind of guile and just very deceptively quite handsy and quite clever on the court, and that's certainly something that can separate herself from a pack where, look, you do have your players with a little bit more versatility, but on the whole, in that top 100 of the WTA, you've still got a lot of power baseliners. So I think she's definitely got the assets that can make her one of those players that are higher up the rankings. And yeah, it's very tough to kind of put a number on it with these players as to where they could go, because there is so much chopping and changing on the circuit constantly. But I think there's been a definite kind of upwards trajectory for Kostyuk ahead of this tournament as well. So this is just another big step in the right direction, I feel, for her.
Career high ranking, of course. She's beaten Galfi, Bringle, Friedsam, Danielle Collins, before beating Gracheva in the final. You kind of preempted my question there, Abigail, about how far she can go. I'm going to put Calvin on the spot. I mean, still only 20. Abigail's right. I mean, I remember Kostyuk breaking through at that Australian Open when I, as James would say, was full-time on the tour. And I actually interviewed her that spring or into summer in Madrid, I think it was, just to prove I did once. Used to do some things on the tour. I can't remember if she was 15 or 16 at that point, but they certainly reduced the time because she was so young, which is fair enough. But Calvin, I mean, where do you see her going? I mean, she looked so good a few years ago. It does feel, as Abigail said, like she's started to channel things in the right way on court again, inside the top 40. She's someone you think will be a top 10 player and possibly beyond?
I've not seen loads of her, to be honest. But what I have seen, she's one of those who I would bracket in players who could be top 10 players. But again, I'm say this every week, I'm loath to make predictions on the WTA tour tournaments or in terms of rankings, because just it's so random. There's so much chaos involved that, yeah, she has the ability to be a top 10 player. There's no doubt about it. But so do about 30 other players, and play like top 10 players about 3 weeks of every year.
Well,
I think it's really valid that in terms of chaos, I think that's a great word. One thing I will say for Kostyuk in terms of the week she's just had, as we read out those names, George, she has beaten a good mix of players there in terms of what they bring to the table, particularly Madison Brengle. Like, she's not a name you're going to look at twice, but she's pretty funky. Like, she's one of the toughest players to go up against, I think, in terms of getting a rhythm and that kind of thing. So I think that in itself, like Kostyuk, the player on court, even if those players don't have the rankings that you'd give a second glance, she's going to know that she's come through some tricky opposition there. So I think, as well as everything else, that's a confidence boost for her, a bit of self-belief.
That's an often underrated point about tennis players as well, is how they handle completely different styles. So I think that's a point very well made, Abigail. It's been a week of firsts, not just Kostyuk winning her first title, but a first ATP 500 win for Alex de Minaur. James would be delighted with that segue. He'd be so proud of me. This was in Acapulco. He beat Tommy Paul in the final. Good win over Holger Rune en route. Calvin, it's felt to me like de Minaur, and I don't know if when I wrote this in the notes, I wasn't sure if I was being a bit harsh on him, kind of saying his career's stalled a little bit, but it did feel to me like he sort of hit a ceiling and then stuck around that point for a while. He's back up inside the top 20 now. Where do you see him at the moment, and where do you see him potentially going? Is this someone similarly to Kostyuk who could get to the top 10, or is that just a much tougher gig to crack on the ATP tour and his limitations will be too much?
I'd be surprised if he makes the top 10, to be honest. I think he's probably where he is now, and I think he'll continue to be that for a few years yet. He's somewhere between 15 and 25, I would say, 15 and 30 in terms of where I think he is in terms of the best players in the world. He'll have weeks like this where he can do really well, and his problem will be that I don't think he has anything to trouble the best players in the world in the biggest tournaments. You tend not to see him in the latter stage of the slams for that reason. That he tend with that ranking that he is, he's going to come across one of the best players in the world in either the third or the fourth round, and over 5 sets. I don't really see which of those players he's taking down.
Do you agree?
And if you are ranked at where he is, if you are ranked at that ranking, you either need to do one or two things. You need to be relentlessly winning 500s or 250s, like what Casper Ruud did, or you need to be making big runs in the slams. And he doesn't really do either of those things.
You agree with that, Abigail?
Yeah, pretty much exactly where Calvin stands on de Minaur. I do think he could potentially crack the very edge of the top 10 out of sheer desire and work ethic. I think he wants it enough that maybe he could literally break through at number 10 or something like that. But he's lacking weapons. I mean, I was commentating the Australian Open and I actually said, I mean, way to big up a match, but I said there is no way he's beating Djokovic tonight. And usually you'd make a case for someone, but I felt so bad, but you just could not make a case for de Minaur. He's up against the most complete player in the sport. How does he finish him? Where's his weapon? How does he have a hope? There was absolutely no way. And for a potential top 10 player, even if it's Novak Djokovic, you just shouldn't be able to say that about them, I don't think. So also the Acapulco conditions, he's done very well there. They played to his favor. They were slow, high bouncing court conditions. Taylor Fritz was throwing up on court. Everyone was cramping. For someone of de Minaur's athletic and physical capabilities, he was always going to, I think, be one of the better players in that environment. The conditions are not always going to play to him like that. So well done on a great week. But as Calvin says, a lot is going to have to change, I think, for him to go higher up the rankings.
I mean, you've mentioned those conditions in Acapulco, which we're going to save for the second half, Abigail, because I want to talk more about vomit because it's one of my favourite pastimes. But while we've still got you in our final 5 minutes of the first half before we bid farewell, we did have a listener question this week, and I've just remembered I forgot to look up who they were. I will look them up and thank them at the start of the second half. But the question was, how will the WTA broadcasting work in 2024? Could Prime Video decide to continue with their coverage? Now, I think we're all of the understanding that Sky are picking up the WTA rights as well in 2024. So I'm going to frame this question slightly differently for you, Abigail, and just have a little think. Is it good for the WTA to be going to Sky right now? And I suppose more broadly, your views on the broadcasting and where tennis sits, but particularly with the lean to the women's game at the moment, and perhaps how much visibility that could do with.
Okay, the one good thing there, I think, is that it's in the same place as the ATP. The fact that Sky are taking ATP and WTA tennis the same way Tennis TV used to broadcast ATP and WTA tennis. That's probably the last time the WTA broadcast was in a really good place, to be honest. I mean, to me, before tennis went to Amazon Prime, where did you watch? If you didn't have BT Sport, was it? Where did you watch WTA tennis in the UK? Essentially, you couldn't. So I think, look, what Sky will do with it remains to be seen. I've heard that that's in the very, very early stages of development. But I think you've already got a plus that the WTA is with the ATP, because I think that is going to draw more of an audience. But more than anything, people know where to go to watch their tennis. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, I work in the sport and I think it's ridiculous the number of subscriptions that I have in order to watch tennis all the year through. It's you've got to work hard to watch tennis, and if we want to keep growing the sport, it shouldn't be like that. So I really hope Sky can do something good with both products in the coming years.
The question was from John Williamson, by the way, so I've got that in before going into the second half. But
Thank you,
Calvin,
John.
But Calvin, you've long spoken about how annoying it is to kind of try and navigate the tennis in Amazon, never mind just navigating where things are going to be broadcast full stop. Are you quite positive about this return to Sky?
On the face of it, yeah, I am. I want to see what they're going to do with it in terms of they've got to have the multi-match facility on. It's got to be red button and watch any of the matches of the tournament, because that is what Amazon had. That was the only, I think, that was the good thing about Amazon. It wasn't the only good thing. Some of the presenting was decent and that kind of thing. Once you'd eventually got there, once it took you 10 minutes to get the tennis on.
True.
But they've got to have that. We can't go backwards now where it's just we're watching a choice of one match per tournament. It's got to be red button, and then the choice of all the matches that are going on at the time, because that's what Amazon had. So if they're going to do that, then I think it's a positive that it's back on Sky, yeah, because their product was actually very good when they had tennis.
Yeah. Oh, excuse me. Well, completely lost my throat there. Here, I was going to say in much more cool fashion. On that very awkward note, I think that brings us to the most awkward note of the night, where we have to say goodbye to Abigail. Abigail, thank you so much for coming on the show again. Always a pleasure to have you. And apologies, it was with me navigating rather than the much more smooth James Gray. We'll be back in part 2, we being me and Calvin Betton, to take a few more of your questions where I'll remember who actually asked them, and to talk a bit more about Taylor Fritz and the Acapulco Sick. Welcome back to part 2 of Tennis Unfiltered. It's just me and Calvin Betton, without James Gray and without first half performer Abigail Johnson. Calvin, I said we'd come back to Acapulco. Quite interesting scenes this week. I mean, it's not often you see a player kind of throwing up on court. This was, of course, Taylor Fritz throwing up against Tommy Paul. It was the longest match in Acapulco's history, and I'll read you a statement from his girlfriend after the match. After he got sick on court last night, we were up until 4 a.m. with the tournament doctors. He couldn't keep any food down, chills, severe dehydration, full body cramping, and almost had to go to the hospital. So scary. He's too stubborn to default and pushed himself too hard. These high humidity tournaments are no joke. Sad way to end the week, but so proud of the few weeks and excited to get to Indian Wells. I mean, quite a lot to unpack there. I mean, let's start just with the him being ill in the first place. Have you seen much like that before at this kind of humidity where someone just starts feeling ill? In, they were tough conditions and it was a long match, but it is quite unusual just coming out of a serve and not getting a time violation, etc.
Sampras played Jim Courier at I know it was the 1995 Australian Open, because remember I was at college at the time, so people get a grasp on how old I am there. And he was throwing up on the court at that time, and I think that was a bizarre one because his coach had just died. Tom Gullickson and Tom or Tim, I don't know which one it was, had just died, and he was very emotional, but was also actively vomiting on court and ended up winning. And it was a big thing about, that's the one that always stands out to me as someone actually vomiting on court and being sick. But yeah, I mean, I don't really know what Taylor Fritz's girlfriend is suggesting there. Like, we're not going to have tennis tournaments where there's any humidity. We're kind of, we're writing off a lot of good venues there, aren't we?
I thought it was quite interesting, or the line that really stood out to me was where she said, he is too stubborn to default and pushed himself too hard. Is there any degree to which that, athletes like you have in boxing where people throw the white towel on, etc. Is there anyone who should be able to take a step in that moment when you can see someone's not doing well, or, in other sports you can be subbed off by the manager? Is it, there are going to be players who refuse to retire, whatever happens, but is there something about kind of safeguarding players there at all?
I don't think so. No, I mean, he's not died, and he's not even, he's just dehydrated. Like, we've had a few cases before where players go on the intravenous drip after because they're dehydrated. That's all it was. Might have had a bit of food poisoning or something. Don't know what, it's just one of those things. I wouldn't read a whole lot into it. And it's not I find it weird. I do wonder whether he's just eating something a bit dodgy, because it's not like he's the kind of player who he's having long grinding rallies, and he's from California. It's not like he's not used to heat or, playing in warm conditions. He's been on the tour for years. Probably just one of those things, but he's fine now.
Is there any danger of mental scarring from his perspective, in the sense of, we spoke about Draper, for example. Well, we spoke about Draper, didn't we, a few years ago, collapsing from the heat, and you might think, in your head, can I get through this? Is my body capable to get up with this? It may be a bit different with Fritz a bit later in his career, but can anything like that affect you?
I don't think so. He's won a Master Series literally in the middle of the desert. So I can't see as the heat's a problem for him. Like it's, I don't, I just think it's one of those things. The human body's a strange thing, isn't it? Sometimes you just vomit, and there's no explanation for it. It's probably a combination of a lot of things. But no, I doubt he's like, I doubt he's getting the concerns when he next has to play somewhere that's hot.
Well, we've had something to talk about anyway with Fritz, if nothing else. But we're confident he's going to be fine. That's the certified Calvin.
I mean, it's not even the worst. It's not. There's ITF Futures tournaments and challengers in Thailand where the players say that you've got to get there a week before just to acclimatize, and they are, I think, pound for pound, the futures and the challengers in Thailand are anywhere in Thailand are probably pound for pound the toughest tournaments to win relative to the level of player that you are, because that is like a completely different level of humidity than what you will face anywhere else on tour. And I don't think, in Acapulco, I think, the humidity is quite bad, but those ones in Thailand with the heat and the humidity in their sort of on their summertime, they are very, very tough. And if I ever see, I mean, a British lad, Stuart Parker, won one last year, won a challenger out in Thailand. And I said at the time, like, that is a hell of an achievement. To win one of those, being from Britain, where you don't experience any of that, is a huge achievement. Those tournaments tend to be won by people from either from Thailand or Southeast Asia, or countries that do have a lot that where humidity isn't a problem.
This might be a bit of a silly question, but I mean, where does humidity kind of rank in toughest conditions for players versus, maybe like altitude or stuff like that?
It's tough. Altitude, I think they struggle more with how the ball behaves than anything else. But humidity is I think the toughest one, just because it's tough, because you can't, if you're not from a place where you get it, if you're from one of those countries, you become used to it. But if you're from Britain or anywhere in Europe, really, then you don't experience it. So it's like playing in a completely different environment to what you're used to, and depending on different levels of it. But I mean, I've not played at that high enough level to say it was an issue, but I never found humidity that bad. I've played in such as Florida, where there is quite a bit of humidity and that kind of thing. I always found extreme heat to be tougher than I know a lot of players say it's the humidity's worse than extreme heat. I always found extreme heat to be tougher, but I know a lot of players they don't like humidity, again because of how it makes them feel, and then how it makes the balls behave, which I believe we're going to be talking about shortly, aren't we?
Indeed, we will. Before we go to the balls, there was a sight that was quite nice to see this week of Naomi Osaka hitting on court whilst quite heavily pregnant. We'll start from there before saying who was watching over, but nice to see she's got at least enough passion for the game amidst her kind of time away that she's spoken about coming back. We can hope this is a really good positive period for her, where she gets enforced time away, realizes how much she misses it, and maybe comes back to push the like of Swiatek at the top. Or am I getting too ahead of myself there, Calvin?
No, I really hope it does happen, and it's a positive sign, isn't it? And she didn't look like she was just there for a hit about, did she? She was looked pretty intense, all things considered. How she was striking it, and the level of intensity that she had within herself, it looked pretty good to me. Yeah.
She had a pretty famous face watching on from behind her. I mean, I've not seen any suggestions this is anything serious that may be considered when she comes back to the tour, but it was the great Andre Agassi kicking around, running the rule over her. Just taking a hypothetical and supposing Agassi wanted to coach Osaka when she came back, or she wanted input from someone like Agassi, what are the sort of things he could provide to her, and what are the sort of things she might want to be getting from someone like Agassi, whether this just in this time or going forward potentially?
I it wouldn't surprise me if it happens. Agassi doesn't. He's not on court with a lot of people a whole lot, and I don't really see what he would be on court for if he wasn't at least running a bit of a rule over how she was hitting it and that kind of thing. It's a strange one, isn't he, Agassi? He's not really done any coaching from none of the players from that era did really. Sampras didn't do.
He had the spell with Djokovic,
with Djokovic,
it was him and Stefanik.
Yeah, I think was that in the tree hugging era. I think it was, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, and it was specifically. So I remember speaking to Agassi. I interviewed him after they'd broken up, and one of the first ones he'd spoken about this breakup between them, and he was saying a lot how Djokovic was going through this phase where he was refusing to have any surgery on his elbow, and he was trying to encourage him to do that, but Djokovic wanted to kind of heal it through other means. So I think, to give Agassi the benefit of the doubt, there was an awful lot kind of going on there that maybe inhibited that partnership.
I'd like to see him working with a player. I think that'd be a fascinating matchup with Osaka because they're very similar players, both brilliant ball strikers. And I think what Agassi would add is Agassi from when he first came on the scene was reckless. He was basically a brilliant ball striker and not a whole lot else. And as his career developed, he became a master tactician, really, through help from Brad Gilbert and through Darren Cahill. And I'd love to see him maybe work with Osaka on that and maybe bring some of his expertise on that in those areas to her game. Again, I'll come back to it that you never, just because you know how to play tennis doesn't mean you know how to express that to other people. So he might not be a very good coach. I don't know, but he's one who I'd like to see brought in that respect and work with one of the top players. I think he will be beneficial to a lot of the players, really, male and female. But that would be one that would really interest me, I think. If it's a strange one, isn't it? Because she's probably not going to play a tournament for at least another year, you'd think. I know she was talking about playing next year's Aussie Open, but I just can't see that happening.
I mean, he's someone I've interviewed a few times and found him to be a really engaging, thoughtful, outspoken, honest person, and probably someone I've enjoyed interviewing as much as anyone else, really. But I mean, from a purely tennis perspective of people looking from the outside in, I mean, it's the sort of matchup that would get people interested, wouldn't it? I mean, it's two huge names. Like, this is only a good thing for the sport if it were to happen.
Yeah, I mean, Agassi was absolute box office. There's nobody who filled stadiums like Agassi did, and I include Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, anybody. There's nobody who could command a stadium or who guaranteed a sellout more than Andre Agassi. He was an absolute megastar.
Even more than McEnroe, your favorite?
I'd have him absolutely on the same table. McEnroe was a different era. McEnroe was the biggest star at a time when tennis was at its most popular. Whereas Agassi, for a while, dragged the sport when it was waning. And every time he was on, I mean, I remember when he retired, when it was his last tennis match, when it was his last tournament, which was the US Open in, I think, it was either 2006 or 2007. I don't think he'd announced it was his last tournament, but the feeling was it was. And I was getting up in the middle of the night and watching his matches right through because you just didn't know how long was left and you wanted to watch. You know, he was absolute box office for anyone who didn't get to see too much of him. Just the way he played. I mean, when he first came on the scene, was like no one even looked like him. He looked like an absolute alien. Like, he dressed differently from everyone else. Like, just playing in denim shorts. Like, imagine like that kind of thing. And then the night got on it. He wore these trainers. Like, the lads. I mean, I talk about trainers quite a lot with the lads I coach, and they can't believe that he used to play in these like high tops. Like, why is he playing in basketball trainers? But he did, and it was just. And I remember the first time I saw him play. I never actually saw him play live, which was a big regret of mine. But I saw him practice at Wimbledon, And I don't think I've ever seen, maybe Del Potro was the only player who could say those two are by far the cleanest ball strikers I've ever seen. Just the sound of the ball as they hit it was mesmerizing.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a bit of Agassi as a young kid on TV, obviously kind of the back end of his career. But, I always remember just looking back at pictures of him, like, I only remember him without hair, really. So that kind of that phase. But he had incredible hair early in the career, and it was also colourful.
The long hair with the headband, and then he had the baseball. And he just this was the thing. People would he had these, and I don't know whether it was him who did it or whether he had people sort of advising him on his branding and that kind of thing. Because he had the headband. And then, like the first time he came to play Wimbledon, he played it 1 year and he lost first round early to Henri Leconte, but then he just didn't play it because there was a big thing about the clothes that he wore, and he wore the black denim shorts and the electric yellow and black night gear, and he basically didn't play because he said he didn't like grass and he wasn't going to wear all white, and then he announced he was going to play it. And it's hard to express the attention that was given. Like people were questioning, like, is he gonna wear all white, or is he gonna come to Wimbledon and not wear the whites? And he basically he warmed up in the tracksuit, so he kept it right until the last minute, right until the first point was played. And everyone was watching. No one knew, and he basically he got the Nike gear just how it was, but he transferred it to all white. So he still had the cycling shorts, so it's white denim shorts. Still had the white cycling shorts underneath it. The trainers were the same, but where it was yellow and black, it was now just all white, and it was marketing genius. And then he came back then a year later, and he still had the long hair, but he had the ponytail through the back of the baseball cap. And then that's when he won Wimbledon, and then he dropped off again. He went missing and dropped out of the top 100 and came back. I think he's the only wild card to win the US Open still in 1994. And then at the 1995 Australian Open, there was another similar to that Wimbledon thing. Like no one knew, and he just basically changed his whole brand. He had these baggy shorts on, and he'd shaved his head, and he had this pirate bandana on. It was this pirate look, and he had these hoop earrings and a goatee beard, and he was absolute box office, was Agassi.
Well, he's certainly a very riveting person to hear speak even today, and I'm fairly sure, if he did come back, it would only be good news, and as it would be if we got Osaka back on the tour. So yeah, really, really nice to see her out hitting this week. Just sticking very, very briefly on WTA Tour before moving to a couple of your listener questions. We had Donna Vekic picking up a title in Monterey. She beat Caroline Garcia. Garcia's lost a couple of finals recently, but that's a really good result for Vekic. I mean, she's someone who really dropped down quite badly due to injury. She's now, I think 23 in the world again. Quite the redemption arc for her. Yeah,
she's had a decent year, hasn't she, so far? Got her own clothing brand as well, hasn't she, that she's wearing? So maybe that's pushed her to start winning some tennis matches.
Thinking of all the dollar that can come with it, perhaps.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, we are now going to hit up our listener questions. Congratulations to Beckett. I'll just quickly run you through who she beat en route to the title: Surenko, Navarro, Bonaventure, Zhu, and then Garcia. That's a pretty solid week for her in Monterey, and really good to have her back at the top of the game. But it's also really good to have you all back, you, the listener, that is. Oh, my word. What some great questions we've had this week, as James might say. This one is from @Wazza Melbourne, or Ian Warren, as he goes. And he's started off by saying balls, ... tennis balls, ... At the Australian Open, many players were complaining about the balls, and I read similar comments in Dubai. What can be done to fix this? Calvin, I mean, Ian's right in the sense that a lot of players are talking about balls on the tour this year. We spoke a little bit, I think it was Swiatek last year, saying she was struggling with the balls in some areas. I remember Ash Barty saying there were certain balls at the US Open that meant she wouldn't be able to win that slam. Not that she actually gave it another crack in the end. But there's been a few on the men's side this year as well, with I think Medvedev complaining. Seen some other comments. How important are the balls, and how much credence do you take to what these people are saying? Is it that big a factor?
The thing with what you have to understand with tennis players is that whenever there's a new ball, they'll complain about it. They always say they don't like the new balls. Like whenever there's a new brand of ball or a new type of ball, you'll never hear a tennis player go, I'll tell you what, like these new ones. Like they complain about them every time. The Australian ones this year were new, and again, we're back to the humidity thing, which is where I mentioned it earlier. They're trying to find a ball that doesn't fluff up. It's like hair; it's covered in felt. So, as those listeners that we've got that are lucky enough to have hair will know that one of the things that happens in humidity is your hair goes frizzy, and that's no different from a tennis ball. It fluffs up. So they're trying to find a way to prevent that happening as soon as it does. The tennis balls in Australia this year, the players were saying that they were moving in the air. So any football fans will know it's basically like the modern football, where for some reason we started creating footballs that didn't move in a straight line when they were shot. I've never understood why they did that in football, really. But that's what they were saying about those tennis balls in Australia, that they did move for the first few games. So that's why they didn't like them then. But the problem is that ideally you just have an ATP Tour ball, and that's what you would have, or that they'd play with the same ball at all the tournaments. That's never going to happen because the tournaments like to negotiate their own ball deals, and we also need there's Wilson, Babolat, Dunlop, and Penn are the big ball producers. There's also Tretorn, and there's a couple of smaller ones that produce them as well, and those companies would go out of business if no tournaments played with their balls. So you're going to have to that we'll never get to a state where we're playing with the same ball, and you couldn't regulate them to all make the same ball because they all like to think that their balls are better than the others. So, but look, no tennis match has ever been lost because of I know that one of the coaches was Ash Barty's coach, wasn't he? Was saying that she'd never win the US Open because of the balls that they use there. I don't know why the men and women play with different balls. That's just idiocy at the US Open. There's no need for that. But yeah, I don't. It's one of those things. If you can't win it with the ball, then you can't win the tournament. They're the balls that you play with at the tournament. So I don't think it's like, oh, the balls have cost me this tournament. Ludicrous to talk like that.
I mean, Medvedev was one of the people who was really actively against the balls, and he's obviously gone on to win this tournament, so it can't have been that bad. But I'll just read you a couple of his quotes, Gavin, because they are quite funny, I think. The last two games before they changed the balls are like apples. They are so big, you're kind of like playing like paddle. You hit the ball, whoever hits it with an angle, you don't feel like you're controlling the game anymore. In Doha and here, I felt like every time 2 or 3 games with new balls, then the game becomes slower. My game was 6-4, 6-2, and it was like 1 hour, 40 minutes, which is almost a nonsense, to be honest. It's because the serve doesn't count as much and it's long points. Like apples is an interesting description, but is there any seriousness to that kind of final point he's making there about, it's dragging matches out too long? Are we, in an era where people can reach the balls so much more than they could previously? You don't need slower balls as well on top of things, do you?
No, you don't. The ball shouldn't be slow. I agree with him on that. It is ridiculous, and they do get tough. I know that, especially because obviously most of the tennis I watch now is doubles, and the balls change every 7 and 9. So basically what you only get one new ball change unless in the doubles. So, and it's a third set champions breaker. So what we've had a couple of times this year is if you have a particularly long second set, you can go, by the time the second ball change comes, you could be playing with those balls for about 40 minutes by the middle of the tie break. And those balls are pretty hard then. And they're hard. pretty soft then, sorry, and what that makes them hard to serve with. What I would like to see, and I don't know why this isn't used anyway, I'd like to see the balls changed at time intervals rather than games. So a change of balls every 25 minutes or every half hour, something like that. Especially in singles, it doesn't make any sense to be saying it's 7 and 9, because you could have 7 games that all went to 4 deuces each, and you could have 9 games that are straight. There's barely any points go against serve. In terms of the players that are playing, you could have. Do John Isner and Riley Opelka need new balls after the first 7 games? There's barely been any balls hit with them. Whereas you could put Medvedev and Alcaraz on the court in Indian Wells this week. They're going to batter the hell out of those balls over the course of 9 games. So I don't see any reason why you wouldn't say, right, we're changing the balls every 25 minutes or every 30 minutes.
So presumably it'd have to be over a certain time period, and then the next break.
Yeah, the next game.
At
the end of this game, then that's when the balls are getting changed. That would make more sense to me, because it can have an effect. That's where it can have an effect is when you get the new balls at what stages in the sets and that kind of thing. Or not when you get the new ones, having to serve the last game with the old balls. That is tough. That can be really tough.
Yeah, I think that sounds a very, very sensible suggestion to me, to be honest, Calvin, and one you should write a formal letter to the tour about. I've never heard anyone articulate that.
Yeah, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't do that. And it's different, like down the tours. So at the Future Circuit, they only have balls every 11 and 13, which is really different. Yeah, and you don't get any new balls in qualifying. It's one set of balls.
I have to say that the club matches I play, Calvin, you just get 1 tube of balls for the whole match and you're done.
Yeah,
so tough times for all of us out there. All of us.
Yeah.
We've got one more listener question before we wrap things up anyway, and this is a bit of a challenging one. I did intend to do my research before we came on and completely forgot. So I'm going to do mine quickly now and then put you on the spot whilst I do that, Calvin. We've got, who are the players, both ATP and WTA? This is a question from Rahul Misra on Twitter. So who are the players, both ATP and WTA, outside the top 50 who could make a giant leap up the rankings this year? This is your opportunity to line yourself up for a I told you so moments in December. Now, we do normally do this at the start of the year, but to be fair, I think we do it about young. Well, no, do we do it? I think it's just anyone, isn't it? Anyone who shifts up the rankings. So this is similar. Yeah. Is there anyone catching your eyes? Should we do the men's first? Let you go.
Yeah.
So the usual rules we have is whoever climbs the highest. I don't think that's too controversial. Should we say between 50 and 100? Keep it in that thing, or do you want to go anywhere outside the top 50?
Anywhere, because mine isn't in the top 100.
Okay, go on then. I'll let you.
A player who I think is going to be top 50 within the next year is Leandro Reedy from Switzerland, who I've seen a lot of because he's basically played the same tournaments as Henry and Julian and Luke, who I coach. But he plays singles and they play doubles. But he's a phenomenal talent. He's a great ball striker. He's one of the best returners that is out there. He's a phenomenal returner. Huge hitter, competes great, knows how to win matches. He's a great lad. But yeah, he's without a doubt, he's going to be top 50 in my book. And I think he's going to go a lot higher than top 50 as well.
There we go. Big call. I don't have anyone I'm as invested in as that, Calvin, as I'm quickly scanning through the rankings. Yeah. I can't believe I forgot to do
another player who I would say to keep an eye on. You go with yours, George, because I need to get this lad's name right, because it's not easy to pronounce.
Well, I was half considering an incredibly optimistic punt on Andy Murray at 55. Actually, I'll tell you who I will go for outside the top 50. Ranked one place below Andy Murray, and someone we've spoken about a lot before. We go for Jack Draper.
Oh, I was
World
going to say,
number
Jack, I thought it was
56 at the
in
minute.
50. He's been inside top 50, though. Can you have that?
56. I think so. He says, who outside the top 50 could make a giant leap up the rankings this year? I think he's got to make a big jump to do well. But yeah, I think I'll go for Draper. Now I've seen him drop out. It's always a bit of a bold pick getting someone who's actually closer to 50 rather than further out. You've got a lot more ground to cover. But the
other lad, it's a bit lower down, but the other one who I would say to keep an eye on, he won't be top 50 this year, but I think he certainly will be, is like Dino Prismic from Croatia. He's currently ranked about 400 and he's only 17. But I think he's definitely on his way up. He's one to keep an eye on.
There we go. One to keep an eye on indeed. And for the women? And you can't play your usual. Anyone could climb up there.
No, I mean, I would say, the obvious ones are the Fruitova girls, aren't they? I think they're going to do it, but that's not really sticking my neck out. I've got to be honest, I haven't watched a whole lot of most of the tournaments I'm at now are just the men's, so I haven't seen a whole lot of the women's from that low level down. But the Fruitova girls are going to be top 50. There's no doubt. Yeah,
they were who I had my eye on as well. But I'll go for another Czech, actually, someone who's impressed me a lot this year, Linda Noskova, who's actually ranked one below Fruitova. I would also say I would prefer to go for Fruitova, but for the sake of picking someone else to keep it interesting, I'll go for Noskova. What a pipeline the Czechs have at the minute. Of course, we may well hope it's Emma Raducanu who does the climb. She's at 77 at the minute, but that feels some way off at the moment. Calvin, James normally asks at this point if there's any other business, and it's normally only me whoever puts their hands up. Do you have anything you want to have a burning desire to say before we
no,
draw an end to this?
No. We can draw it. We can draw the line now.
Draw the line. The line will indeed be drawn then, and drawn it has been. Thank you so much for listening. As ever, please do leave us a 5-star review and rating on any of the podcast outlets. Anywhere you get your podcasts, you can listen to us, as you already know, because you're already here. But thank you so much for tuning in once more. James will be back next week, meaning that this will be hosted infinitely better. But thank you once more to Abigail Johnson and, of course, Calvin Betton, and we'll see you next week.
Sports Social Podcast Network.